Meg Lundsager is a current public policy fellow with the Wilson Center and a former U.S. executive director and alternate executive director with the International Monetary Fund. She joins us to discuss attempts to reform the IMF. And Meg, we've had a reform proposal on the table agreed to by most countries, all countries, in 2010, since 2010, supported by the Obama administration, large support around the world. Why no action?
There's no action yet because the reforms by the United States have to be approved by Congress because these are major changes. We're increasing our ownership shares, our quota in the IMF, and we're also amending the Articles of Agreement. And that's a treaty change, and therefore in the United States we need congressional approval.
Explain what that means when you say we're going to change the quota arrangement. What does that mean?
The quota arrangement, quotas is the IMF term for our ownership share in the organization. And the proposal is to move funds that have been in bilateral, in a multi-country borrowing agreement that many countries have had with the IMF, and shift those over to quota shares. So for the United States, our financial commitment to the IMF will not change. We're just shifting the same amount of money from one account to another. But we still need congressional approval for that, and we need congressional approval for the amendments of the articles.
So then what would be the outcome if these reforms were to pass? What would change?
What would change is that, first of all, the rest of the world would breathe a huge sigh of relief, and I think the U.S. would regain a lot of respect because it's been very difficult the past few years to push U.S. initiatives when this obstacle has been in the way, when we haven't been able to deliver on this commitment. The ownership shares would change a bit the composition of the board. We're already seeing a little bit of that. There's been a little bit of European consolidation. But it would give the emerging markets a little bit more voting power, bring them partway to their share of the global economy. I mean, interesting. China still won't have a share equal to its weight in the global economy. Neither will India, right? So it's going to take a long time for these countries to get to where they should be, just given how change occurs very slowly.
And ultimately, you're talking about the bottom line. It's where the money goes, what will ultimately be affected.
It's not so much where the money goes in terms of who borrows, but it's in terms of who puts the money into the organization and the relative voting power we have as we're making decisions. Now, the reality is in the IMF, most decisions are taken by a pretty broad majority. But nonetheless, the emerging markets have felt that because they haven't been able to overcome this great weight of the United States, Japan, and Europe, that the developed world has set the agenda, and they feel that hasn't been fair. And I think there's been a lot of recognition of that, and that's why the U.S. started pushing these reforms a number of years ago.
As the impatience has grown, we've heard rumblings from the G20 about discussing ways to work around the U.S. inaction. Are any of those possible or probable?
I don't think they're probable. Some of them may be possible, where there could be an agreement that would give a small increase to just a small number of countries and would rearrange the shares a bit. But that's not what the emerging markets want. They want this increase in the permanent resources agreed. So I think it's still plan A in terms of let's get the U.S. Congress to act. That's the most important thing.
Is that realistic? Is plan A realistic? Is there any reason to be optimistic that a Congress that hasn't acted for 5 years and has ignored all types of lobbying efforts to asking them to do so will suddenly change its mind?
I've been a little more optimistic recently, and I think it's because there's a sense among the leadership that, yes, the United States finally needs to do this. It is eroding our leadership around the world. With that said, it's still ultimately the two houses have to agree, the two parties have to agree, the votes have to be delivered, and there is a budget cost under credit reform. Even though it's the same amount of money moving between accounts, there is a cost according to CBO, so that has to be appropriated as well.
Is there some suggestion that after 5 years have passed that the reforms themselves need an edit? They need to be looked at again, that maybe we need a different set of reforms 5 years later?
Well, there are ongoing plans to have another quota round, another increase that would shift quota resources, voting power, a bit more to the emerging markets, reflecting their growing weight in the global economy. I think it'll be difficult to move quickly on those, even if the U.S. manages to ratify these reforms in the coming months, just because it's a major negotiation among countries, and those that are losing share want to try and minimize that. Those that are gaining share.
So consequently, you think we stick with the reforms that are on the table versus trying to redo it all?
I think we stick with the reforms that are on the table and leave to the future the next set of reforms.
The implications, you've mentioned some of them, and the U.S. standing as not a minor one. What about things like the rise of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or attempts to create alternatives to the IMF? Does this put the IMF and its role at risk?
I am a bit worried about that, to be frank. Last year, the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, agreed to a backup sort of line of credit for each other to protect their foreign exchange reserves. They agreed that last year. They also agreed their own sort of investment bank, let's call it a development bank. And then, of course, this year, China proposed this Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank that a number of countries, including key U.S. allies, have already agreed to join. So it's clear that the U.S. has lost the initiative in terms of leadership, in terms of how we should move forward in international engagement. With that said, I strongly hope that the Chinese and the others still believe that the IMF is a valuable institution, given that it is the place where we work out our agreements on how we're going to manage the international economy.
Can the U.S. regain the initiative? Is it as simple as Congress acting on the reforms?
I hope it's that simple, but it's also based on having good ideas and being willing to listen to other people's, other countries' good ideas and move forward. And I would say in the years I was at the IMF, we did have that good balance. I mean, there are a lot of initiatives that I pushed that, through a lot of hard work, finally did get broad support. For instance, IMF leadership in countering the financing of terrorism and money laundering has been a huge success, but that took a lot of work to persuade the others to go along. But others have been concerned about how the IMF looks at capital controls, and the U.S. was willing to listen, as were other countries' advanced economies, and I think we managed to work out a pretty good system going forward.
Final quick thought is about expectations. Is there any timeline attached to this, or is this, as we've been doing since 5 years ago, just wait and see what happens?
It's wait and see. I mean, the U.S. has veto power over these key decisions, so we really have to wait until the United States approves these, and that's why we're looking to Congress and the administration to work it out and get that vote done.
Meg, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.